Yo guys, so I just got a new laptop. But is having a powerful new MacBook Pro necessary for programmers? Well, the answer is no. But there are a few important things you need to consider when buying a laptop as a programmer, and that's what we'll talk about in this video. The first thing about programming laptops that might surprise you is hardware is actually not that important. The reason I got my laptop is for video editing, which needs a graphics card, a lot of RAM, and ideally an i9 processor too. But the truth is, most programming tasks, with a few notable exceptions, do not require that much computing power. Stepping through these 4 dimensions of hardware, let's talk about why none of these are actually important for programming. When you hear graphics card, you might think of video editing or games, but it might surprise you to hear that graphics cards are actually very useful for deep learning. That being said, unless you're focused on this very specific area of programming, you won't find much use for them. From now on, I'm just going to rule out machine learning from our hardware considerations. Let's talk next about RAM. The more RAM you have, the more programs you can run at the same time without experiencing slowdown. Now, most code editors do not require that much RAM, with a few notable exceptions. If you're running a lightweight editor and willing to close programs running in the background, then you would be fine with 8 GB of RAM, which by today's standards is not that much. Moving on to processors, running servers and programs is not very processor intensive at all. In fact, most services run on incredibly weak small processors, but they may be scaled up if there is a high demand or load on the server. As far as running things locally though, you should never experience any problems as long as you have a machine newer than 5 years old. Now let's talk about storage. In terms of code itself, this takes up almost no space at all since it is literally just text. On top of that, every programmer under the sun stores their code in a version control system like GitHub. Since GitHub has free private repositories now, there's no reason not to upload everything there. What if you have a huge database though? Well, it's pretty much the same. Unless you're storing images, databases do not take up that much space. Even if you do have that many records, chances are it will not be on your local machine, but rather on a server somewhere else. Now that we've established size doesn't matter, there's one last thing I'll mention. There are 2 types of hard drive, SSD and HDD. Without getting too deep into it, the SSD is what you want. It's flash memory, which offers read and write speed up to 3 to 4 times faster than HDD. For the most part, SSD comes standard in new laptops, but if you're buying used, keep an eye out for this. HDD is much cheaper, but you're going to be giving up a lot of speed. So with these things in mind, storage should not be a real bottleneck for you either. In general, as long as your machine is not more than 5 years old, you're going to be okay doing most development work. Moving on from hardware, a consideration that is important is what operating system you use. So the primary 3 are Mac OS, Windows, and Linux. Mac OS and Linux are part of the Unix family of operating systems, meaning they share a shell and are very portable between one another. Portable meaning you can just move programs you develop in Mac over to Linux very easily. Mac OS is of course also known for having a great interface and user experience, and just being generally all around pretty strong. The main drawback, however, is the cost. We all know how expensive Macs are, and you're gonna need Mac hardware to run Mac software. Linux, if you don't know about it, as we just mentioned, is also a Unix operating system. Now, before I start getting flamed by the Linux fanboys, Linux is not actually an operating system. It's what's known as a kernel, which is the core of the operating system that you can build the rest of the system on top of. When you combine a kernel with a distribution, which is the other half, so to speak, of the operating system, then you have a full operating system. This is why Linux is appealing to so many people. Within these distributions, you can have varying levels of customization. So you can have a very bare bones thing with hardly any programs installed and customize it from the ground up, or you can have something that's pretty close to a Mac OS or the Windows out of the box. I will warn you about Linux. If you're starting out as a programmer, getting your distribution set up is a lot of overhead. Another important fact about Linux, most servers in services like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and similar that are running huge companies like Lyft's whole ecosystem and many others, those servers are mostly running Linux. So a very common use case is to write your code in the macOS environment and then deploy it onto a Linux virtual cloud server. Windows, on the other hand, is not Unix, so it has an entirely different command line interface. But in general, Windows does have good support for certain programming ecosystems, which we're going to get into next. Now, moving on from operating system, let's talk about platform tools, or which operating system is best for the tools you need to use for your job. Now, maybe it's obvious or maybe not, but Mac essentially has a monopoly on Swift or iOS development. You're going to have to do this in a program called Xcode, which you can only install on Mac. macOS is also the go-to platform for design software and designers. So if you're a front-end developer who's going to dabble in design, well, you're only going to have access to programs like Sketch, which was the industry standard for a very long time, still very popular within the Mac ecosystem only. As mentioned earlier, if you want to be a true system administrator, Linux might be the best bet for you. There is the Kali Linux for penetration testing, security, and doing things like bug bounties, which basically you find vulnerabilities in a company's systems and they pay you for finding them. So this is all great information, but what do most developers use? Well, I would say slightly anecdotally, I worked at a tech company in San Francisco. Walking around, I would see people, in the cafeteria on every floor, and close to 95% or more people at my company had Macs. Having a Mac when everyone else has one at your company is pretty much a necessity due to those portability, compatibility issues we talked about earlier. But if we look at the data, it tells a different story. Stack Overflow, which puts out a developer survey every year, polled a very large sample of developers. The result of this survey was half of developers used Windows professionally, while the other half were split between Unix operating systems, Linux, and Mac OS. The main reason I can deduce is that software companies outside of the SF bubble, large enterprise companies like things you would think of as more traditional corporations, they are likely using Windows. And it is pretty much the corporate world standard to be using Windows for business software. So most developers at these big companies are working on internal tools for that Windows ecosystem. One thing that we haven't really lingered on so far, but is very important, is cost. For a significantly lower cost, you can get a better value machine on Windows. And to give just a bit more credit to Windows laptops are going to be able to run games where Macs can't really do that. My recommendation though, if you're a beginner, which you likely are if you're watching this video, is still Mac. You have less overhead than Linux, which I promise you don't want to be dealing with when you're a beginner, but you still get the Unix portability. Yes, Macs are very expensive, but you can buy a used Mac for a very reasonable price now that the new one has just come out. That being said, Macs in recent years, until this most recent one, have had some keyboard issues, so that's the only thing I would be a little bit wary of. So bottom line is this. Option number one is a used Mac. They hold up very well over time. So buying a used one, you can get 80% of the performance for a small fraction of the price of a new one. Option two, I would say, is the new Mac. If you have the disposable income, or you can deduct your computer against some side income or personal employment income, then the new keyboard is amazing. You can't go wrong. This is going to hold its value for many years to come. And if you've checked out the reviews, the new MacBook Pro is great. And then finally, I would say if you're getting into some more niche areas of programming, bug bounties, ethical hacking, or you want to work on C# and get into enterprise, well, then I would say a Windows laptop with maybe both Windows and Linux installed might be the best option for you. Anyway, guys, I know this was more of a generic advice video, but I really wanted to do something about laptops because people do ask me all the time what I recommend. So there you go. So this is CodeDrip, and I will catch you guys soon.